Is the outflanking manoeuvre the most common wargaming tactic? And is it actually historical? So if you spend enough time around wargaming tables, whether you're playing Ancients, Napoleonics, World Wars, fantasy, battle, science fiction, whatever, almost anything in between, you'll start to notice certain patterns. Rule sets might emphasise different mechanics, and periods might feature different weapons, formations and technologies, and players will certainly have their own styles and preferences of play. Yet despite all of these differences, there are some tactical habits that seem to appear again and again. Now, it's one of those habits I want to talk about today. Perhaps the most common of all, is the attempted outflank. Now, we've probably all done it. A play, you load one side of the army with extra strength aiming to overwhelm part of the enemy line, or perhaps you pin the enemy frontally while fast troops sweep around the flank. Maybe you create a refused flank, concentrating force on one wing or sacrificing space elsewhere. Sometimes it's a cavalry manoeuvre, sometimes it's an armoured thrust, sometimes it's elite infantry trying to roll up a line from one end. Whatever form it takes, the basic idea is remarkably consistent. Rather than attack evenly across the whole battlefield, the player tries to gain an advantage at one point and then exploit it. And the question is, why do wargamers do this so often? More importantly, is this actually a reflection of how real historical armies fought? Or is it simply a gaming convention that has evolved because it works well on the tabletop? The more I think about it, the more I suspect that the attempted outflank may be the single most common tactical move in wargaming. Now, part of the reason is simple mathematics. If two forces are evenly matched across a battlefield, attacking everywhere equally rarely creates a decisive result. Concentrating strength against a smaller section of the enemy line increases the odds of achieving a breakthrough. Even players with no formal military knowledge quickly discover this through experience. After a few games, they realise that spreading forces evenly often leads to stalemate, whereas concentrating forces creates opportunities. What makes this particularly interesting is that the outflanking manoeuvre can take many different forms. Now, the most obvious version is the classic strong wing. A player places a disproportionate amount of their army on one side of the table and attempts to crush the opposing flank before the enemy can react. Once that section collapses, the victorious forces can turn windward and attack the remainder of the enemy army from the side. This is probably the version most people immediately picture when discussing flanking tactics. Another variation is the fixing attack. Here the player deliberately engages the enemy frontally, not necessarily expecting to win that fight, but simply to hold the enemy in place. And while attention is focused on the centre, a separate force manoeuvres around the side. Now, historically, this resembles countless military operations where one force pins the enemy while another seeks a more advantageous position. Then there's the refused flank. Rather than trying to outflank immediately, a player deliberately weakens one side of their line and strengthens the other. The battlefield becomes asymmetrical. The weaker wing is expected to survive rather than win, while the stronger wing seeks the decisive result. Many experienced players can use this approach with ruthless efficiency. A related variation appears in games featuring mobile troops, cavalry in Ancients games and Napoleonics, tanks in 20th century games, or fast attack units in science fiction systems often spend much of the battle searching for opportunities around the edges of the battlefield. Sometimes they never actually reach the enemy flank, but the threat alone forces reactions. Opponents divert troops, adjust deployments and change their plans simply because they fear being outmanoeuvred. Now, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all of this is that many players arrive at these tactics independently. Nobody necessarily teaches them. They emerge naturally from the logic of the game. If you want local superiority, if you want to fight part of the enemy rather than all of it at once, flanking becomes an attractive solution. Try the same move in the centre of the enemy line and you run the risk of running straight into the jaws of a pincer. And this leads us naturally to the historical question: were real armies as obsessed with flanking manoeuvres as wargamers are? And the answer, I think, is both yes and no. There is certainly no shortage of famous historical examples, and one of the most celebrated victories in military history is the Battle of Cannae in 1216 BC, where Hannibal famously enveloped the Roman army. The Roman centre pushed forward, believing success was within reach, only to find themselves attacked from both flanks and eventually surrounded. military academies still study the battle today. Centuries later, countless commanders have pursued similar ideas. At Leuthen in 757, Frederick the Great concentrated against one wing of the Austrian army. Napoleon repeatedly sought to manoeuvre against enemy flanks and rear areas. During the American Civil War, commanders constantly searched for opportunities to turn enemy positions. In both world wars, operational planning frequently revolved around bypassing strong points and attacking vulnerable areas. Now, at first glance, this seems to support the idea that wargamers are simply doing what successful generals have always done. However, history also reveals something important that tabletop games often disguise. Actually achieving a flank attack was incredibly difficult. On the tabletop, players enjoy perfect knowledge of the battlefield. They can see every unit, they know exactly where the table edge is, they know the enemy cannot suddenly discover an unexpected river and disappear into dense woodland, or march 30 miles overnight to a completely different location. Real commanders faced enormous uncertainty that wargamers don't. I mean, many historical battles were not elegant manoeuvres. They weren't that sort of contest. They were confused, messy, and often characterised by frontal fighting. Commanders might dream of turning an enemy flank, but terrain, logistics, communication failures, exhaustion, and enemy reactions frequently prevented them from doing so. In fact, one could argue that much of military history consists of commanders trying and failing to execute the kind of manoeuvres that routinely succeed on our gaming tables. Consider how many battles begin with plans for grand manoeuvres but end in head-on confrontations. Armies often stumble into each other unexpectedly. Roads, limited movement, supply considerations, constrained options, weather interfered, units became separated, orders arrived late or not at all. The desire to outflank was certainly present, but the ability to achieve it was often limited. This is where I think tabletop wargaming sometimes creates a distorted impression of history. Many rule sets are built around tactical decision making within a relatively confined battlefield. The table has edges. Forces start within a certain distance of each other, objectives are visible, players know the battle will be resolved within a few hours. Under those conditions, manoeuvring against a flank becomes very attractive because it can produce a dramatic result. Real warfare often operated on a much larger scale. Entire campaigns could be devoted to threatening a flank, cutting a line of communication, or forcing an enemy to abandon a position without a major battle ever occurring. What we represent as a 20-minute cavalry sweep around the side of a table might historically require weeks of marching, reconnaissance and logistical preparation. Another factor that I alluded to a moment ago is that tabletop war games reward decisive action. Nobody wants to spend 6 hours watching two armies cautiously maintain their positions. Players generally seek opportunities to create advantage and generate interesting outcomes. Flanking manoeuvres are exciting. They create movement, tension and drama. They reward planning. They often produce memorable moments. As game mechanics, they are extremely satisfying. I mean, this may explain why flanking manoeuvres appear even in periods where historically armies were often less flexible than their tabletop counterparts. It's remarkable how frequently players discover opportunities for manoeuvre that real commanders would have struggled to exploit under historical conditions. Now, last year I ran a War of the Roses game where one player insisted on trying to outflank the enemy positions, when in reality during that period blocks of troops had very little flexibility, and when smaller battles tended to march towards larger battles, they tended to stretch out to match the frontage of the enemy. It's what Oxford did at Bosworth when facing the numerically larger battle under Norfolk. But there's also a psychological element to the popularity of this tactic. Most people instinctively dislike attacking strength directly. Faced with a strong enemy position, the natural reaction is to look for weaknesses elsewhere. Wargamers are no different. If the centre appears heavily defended, players immediately begin looking at the flanks. Where is the gap? Which unit is isolated? Where can pressure be applied most effectively? Now, in many ways, the outflank represents a search for efficiency. Rather than fighting the enemy at their strongest point, you seek their weakest. That idea has enormous historical pedigree. In fact, some military theorists might argue that the real principle is not flanking at all. The real principle is concentration against weakness. Sometimes that weakness appears on a flank, sometimes it appears in a gap between formations, sometimes it appears in the enemy's logistics or communications or morale or supply. The underlying concept remains the same. Successful commanders often sought to bring superior forces against an inferior portion of the enemy. Now, viewed from that perspective, perhaps wargamers are not really obsessed with flanking. Perhaps they're obsessed with concentration of force, and flanking simply happens to be the easiest way to achieve it on a tabletop battlefield. That distinction matters because it helps explain why the tactic feels so universal across different periods and different genres. Whether you're commanding Roman legions, medieval knights, Napoleonic battalions, Sherman tanks, or futuristic battle mechs or fantasy orc hordes, the underlying logic remains remarkably consistent. If you can create local superiority somewhere, you improve your chances of success. What changes is the method. Sometimes that means physically turning a flank, sometimes it means concentrating artillery, sometimes it means achieving air superiority or exploiting mobility. Different eras provide different tools, but the principle remains recognisable. Before we move on, I just wanted to have a quick shout out to the amazing people who make these videos possible, our channel members. If you're enjoying the content, please consider joining the team. Memberships start at just £1. Now back to today's topic. So is the attempted outflank the most common tactic used by wargamers? My instinct says yes. Not because every player consciously sets out to recreate Cannae or study military theory, but because the logic emerges naturally from the conditions of tabletop gaming. Concentrate strength, create local superiority, attack part of the enemy with more force than they can bring to bear, and the flank is often the easiest place to do that. But does this reflect historical reality? Well, partly. History certainly contained countless examples of commanders seeking to outmaneuver their opponents and attack vulnerable points. The desire to avoid strength and exploit weakness is nearly universal. Yet history also reminds us that achieving these manoeuvres was often far more difficult than our gaming tables might suggest. Many real commanders spent far more time dealing with uncertainty, logistics, terrain, communication problems, and operational constraints than most wargamers ever need to consider. Perhaps the most accurate conclusion is that wargamers have captured an important historical principle, but often experience it in a simplified form. The principle of concentrating force against weakness is deeply historical. The ease with which we can execute it on the tabletop sometimes isn't. And maybe that's perfectly fine. After all, we're not conducting real military operations. We're trying to create enjoyable, challenging and engaging games. If the attempted outflank keeps appearing on our tables, perhaps that's because it represents something fundamental about both warfare and gaming. It rewards planning, creates drama, encourages manoeuvre and offers the possibility of a decisive result. These are the qualities that make for memorable battles, whether they're fought with lead soldiers, plastic miniatures or real armies. So now I'd like to hear from you. Do you think the attempted outflank is the most common tactic in tabletop wargaming? When you look back at your own games, what manoeuvre appears most often? Do you find yourself concentrating force on one wing, pinning the enemy while another force moves around the flank, or pursuing some entirely different approach? And how closely do you think our tabletop tactics reflect historical reality? Please share your thoughts and experiences and favourite examples in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you observed in your own gaming tables. So that's it for this week. Please join the chat in the comments and don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell for your weekly fix. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming and of course, keep rolling high.